sit wherever you want, and I'll recognize you in the order that I was going to recognize you, regardless of your seats. It's like musical chairs. We have enough chairs for each of you, and if you can find the open one, it will be very helpful to us. We thank you all very much for being here, and we apologize for the delay. This is obviously a very important issue. We may be writing the transmission rules for the next generation of electricity generation in our country over the next couple of weeks. We'll see if that can be accomplished. Perhaps it can, perhaps we can't, but your testimony is going to be central to accomplishing that goal. We could not do it without your participation. We apologize to you for the delay in your panel being recognized and for it being Friday afternoon, getting later as the minutes transpire. We'll begin with Ralph Izzo. He is Chairman, President, and Chief Executive Officer of the Public Service Enterprise Group, Incorporated. He is a leader within the utility industry and the public policy area. We thank you once again for being here. Mr. Izzo, whenever you're ready, please begin.
Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity.
Could you move that microphone in just a little bit closer?
Sure. Thank you for this opportunity to appear before you today to testify. PSEG distributes electricity and natural gas to more than 2 million customers in New Jersey and owns and operates electric generating capacity in the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, and Texas. PSEG has long supported policies to promote renewable generation. We are planning major investments in solar, offshore wind generation, and an energy storage technology that will make renewable energy more competitive. The question today is not whether we should vigorously promote renewable generation, but how. Specifically, how should we use transmission policy to promote renewable generation at the lowest possible cost? This would include not just federal siting authority, but decisions about transmission planning and cost allocation that are fundamental to determining how much transmission is built and where. There are two competing views on this. One view, which I strongly favor, is that government should establish prices for externalities, such as the cost of emitting greenhouse gases, and let market forces determine which technologies and which locations are most promising for investment. This is the approach taken in the landmark ACES legislation. It establishes a price for carbon through a cap-and-trade program and a market-based subsidy for renewable generation through the Renewable Electricity Standard. With these price signals, developers can compare the costs of renewable generation in different locations, including the associated transmission costs. The alternative view is that some central entity should plan and site transmission that will connect areas with strong renewable resources to areas of high electric demand via some green transmission superhighway, paid for by a broad group of taxpayers. Under this model, government would essentially pick winning renewable technologies and locations and build transmission to facilitate them. I have several concerns about this approach. First, it could lead to unnecessarily expensive outcomes. All business owners know that if they establish their factory at a distant location to keep production costs down, they have to weigh that against shipping costs. But if we socialize shipping costs of renewable generation, we skew decisions away from locally based options that may have a lower total cost. That is why a bipartisan coalition of 10 Northeastern governors wrote to Congress warning that this policy would undermine their efforts to grow renewable industries. Moreover, building thousands of miles of transmission lines in anticipation of the arrival of renewable generation may lead to an expensive excess of transmission capacity. Transmission planning is a deliberate process meant to respond to long-term reliability and economic concerns. It is not intended to predict and facilitate dynamic markets. Second, As has been said so many times already, there is no such thing as a green transmission line. Transmission lines carry all electrons without regard to the carbon footprint of the generator. In fact, the dispatchability of renewable resources would suggest you would have a significant underutilization of the transmission line unless you filled it with other forms of generation. So a green transmission line will give market advantage to any power plant fortunate enough to be close to the new line. Third, creating a new planning process across regions is unnecessary. We already have regional planning processes that are effective and sensitive to local concerns. Cross-regional issues should be addressed through improved coordination between regional planning bodies, which is exactly the approach taken in the committee-passed bill. Finally, existing tools can help renewable projects connect to the grid without distorting locational price signals and without potentially burdening customers with an excess of expensive transmission. For example, if the costs of connecting to the grid and getting power to market are too much for one developer to bear, multiple developers can share costs among their projects. Or, FERC can require that ratepayers initially bear these costs, provided they are reimbursed by developers after the projects become operational. In closing, I believe we will meet our long-term carbon reduction goals. But sitting here today, I cannot tell you what renewable technologies, and more importantly, in what locations it will take to get us there to serve our customers at the lowest possible cost. And neither can government. That is why I strongly support policies such as an RES and carbon pricing that send price signals to the market and unleash the creativity and entrepreneurial spirit of the American people. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Izzo, very much. Our next witness is Joe Nipper, who is the Senior Vice President for Governmental Affairs of the American Public Power Association, representing the nation's more than 2,000 community-owned electric utilities. We thank you for being here. Whenever you're ready, please begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the subcommittee. Appreciate the opportunity to be here today. APPA, as you mentioned, represents the interests of 2,000 publicly owned, state and locally owned utilities across the country, collectively serving 45 million Americans. 110 public power utilities collectively own about 8% of the nation's transmission lines of 138 kilovolts or greater. However, the great majority of APPA's members are transmission dependent, that is, dependent on facilities owned by others in order to acquire the electricity they need for distribution to their retail customers. Our members report that more transmission is needed in almost every area of the country to serve a variety of purposes, including increased use of renewable energy, reliability, and to enhance competition. In our view, the single most significant impediment to getting new transmission built continues to be siting, and we urge Congress to clarify and continue to support the federal backstop siting authority included in EPACT 05. The EPACT 05 siting authorities were a major step forward, but have been called into question by the recent court decision in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. As an intervener on the side of FERC in this case, APPA believes that legislation should clarify the original congressional intent in EPAC 05 by expressly providing FERC with the authority to consider backstop transmission siting applications when a state denies an application. It's important to note for us that as units of local and state government, public power utilities are not typically supportive of federal policy that diminishes state authority, and we certainly have had concerns about Congress and FERC's attempt to expand authority in other areas. However, the importance of siting new interstate transmission lines cannot be understated, and thus our continued support of the compromise crafted in EPACT 05. There is some misconception, though, that higher voltage lines are always better. In actuality, the interconnected nature of the grid is such that a lower voltage line, if located strategically, could have a greater ability to relieve congestion and to enhance reliability than a higher voltage line, and could experience less local resistance to the siting and cost less than a higher voltage line. Of course, there are situations where a higher voltage lines is preferable and necessary, but we want to make it clear that bigger is not always better when it comes to the grid. This is one reason why regional planning is so important. The impact of proposed new higher voltage facilities on the existing transmission network needs to be fully considered so that the optimal mix of facilities can be determined. Encouraging proportional joint ownership of transmission facilities by load-serving entities, including public power utilities in a given region, is another way to get more transmission built. If the responsibility for building and owning the transmission grid is spread more broadly among the entities serving customers in a region, then joint transmission planning will be facilitated simply because there are more participants at the planning table supporting the needed projects. If network customers of a dominant regional transmission provider are encouraged to own their load ratio share of the transmission system, transmission usage and ownership will be more closely aligned, and the friction between transmission-dependent utilities and transmission owners can be reduced. There are many examples, Mr. Chairman, where that is the case. With respect to planning, APPA supports the transmission planning provisions, including the committee-passed version of the American Clean Energy and Security Act, as we believe that they will bolster rather than duplicate or further complicate the existing and extensive transmission planning processes under FERC Order 890 occurring at the regional and sub-regional levels across the country. The manner in which transmission facilities costs are allocated among generators, transmission owners, transmission-dependent utilities, and other stakeholders is one of the most controversial topics related to transmission. APPA strongly supported the language included in EPAC that underscores FERC's flexibility in determining the appropriate transmission pricing methodology. We don't always agree with the decisions made by FERC on cost allocation. We continue to believe that Congress had it right in leaving these decisions with appropriate stakeholder input and administrative due process to FERC to determine under Sections 205 and 206 of the Federal Power Act. The issue of who pays for transmission facilities provides regional benefits is a difficult one, as such facilities can provide present and future system benefits that extend well beyond the specific entities for whom the facilities are constructed. Therefore, APPA urges FERC to provide greater guidance on cost allocation for new major transmission facilities that afford regional benefits. APPA does not support the allocation of costs of facilities to regions, subregions, or entities that will receive little or no benefit from the facilities, and therefore opposes a federal statutory requirement to allocate such costs on an interconnection-wide basis. And lastly, Mr. Chairman, APPA has concerns with respect to FERC's application of its incentive rate authority provided under EPACT 05. FERC seems to regard Section 219 as a statutory requirement to offer a variety of different transmission incentives to applicants, and it appears that these entities have been helping themselves to those incentives, and the Commission has not taken a sufficiently disciplined approach to awarding rate incentives. We appreciate your long-held concern in this area and your recent letter to FERC asking for an explanation of their use of their incentives, and we look forward to their response and to working with the Chairman on that issue. Thank you very much.
Mr. Dipper, very much, and I appreciated the very diplomatic way in which you used the word entity in your testimony. Our next witness is Glenn English. He is the Chief Executive Officer of the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association. But more significantly, he served in the United States Congress for 10 terms as one of our most distinguished members, and it's our honor to have you back before the subcommittee. Glenn, whenever you are ready, please begin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. I'm not sure my board of directors would agree with the more significantly, but I appreciate that and understand where you're coming from on that.
I think the one thing that the board and I can share in common is that we'll each reserve to ourselves which of us believes that you had a more important job.
Well, I just appreciate both of you thinking I have an important job.
The fact that you're so important to both of us, I think, is very
You're very kind, Mr. Chairman.
Yourself.
I appreciate that. As I think the members of the committee know, electric cooperatives are consumer-owned. We're in 47 states across the country. And we serve, however, 7% of the population through about 3/4 of the landmass of the United States. So when we talk about transmission and when we talk about the fact that you're talking about generating renewable energy in this country, it's most likely going to come from areas that are served by electric cooperatives. So we have a big stake in that. We plan to have a big part of the future as we move forward in that general direction.
Could you just repeat that number again? 7% of the customers, but what?
We've got 3/4 of the landmass.
Okay, thank you.
And it's all owned by those individual consumers that throughout those 47 states, Mr. Chairman. Also, I think we can all agree that the signing of the American Clean Energy and Security Act of 2009 is going to bring about a profound change in the way that not only energy is generated in this country, but the way that we use energy in this country. It's going to change our lives. And with that understanding, I hope that we can also recognize that we've got to be prepared for that kind of a dramatic change. And the transmission system as it exists today was certainly not designed for this kind of change. In fact, it wasn't designed for the 1992 Energy Act with the deregulation on the wholesale level. So we're still trying to adjust to that. What we would suggest, Mr. Chairman, is that we need a sense of urgency here. And certainly we need transmission as a part of this act. It needs to be addressed in this act. And as a result of that, we think there's some very basic principles that need to be incorporated as you move forward with any kind of legislative language as it applies to this new transmission system, new transmission policy that the country is going to be following. As I think you know, Mr. Chairman, we have established now national renewable cooperatives, so each cooperative in every one of those 47 states can participate in any renewable project in any part of that 3/4 of the land mass of the United States. So a wind project in South Dakota, for instance, may be invested by people from Wisconsin, co-ops from Wisconsin, or they may be from Alabama or Georgia or wherever. They can own a piece of that. And what we're looking for is a way in which we can generate that power through renewables in the most efficient way possible, no matter where it's located. We should be looking for the most cost-effective way in which we can do that. And just as we know that certain wind corridors exist that will provide us with a great amount of production of wind energy throughout the Great Plains, not every farm's the same, not every state's the same, that we also then have got to make sure that when we locate that kind of generation in those areas, that we can move that power out of those regions. So we need an efficient and effective transmission system to do it. But we also, I think, have to be very aware of the fact that, and it's been our experience, that bottom-up planning works the best. So you need local, regional planning. You need local folks putting this plan together to determine what's the best way to move forward on this. And so that is a principle I think we need to adhere to, a bottom-up rather than top-down, as far as planning the transmission system of this country. I would also suggest that under these conditions, and given the fact that we're going to have to move in a more efficient transmission system, we're going to have to move that transmission across state lines, that we may run into difficulties and encumbrances. We may run into delays that, quite frankly, the national best interest is not being served. So I think we've got to, while we're having that local planning, we've got to also make sure that we don't have impediments put in the way that is going to prevent that local planning from being implemented. We've got to make sure that the overall national policy of moving across state lines is dealt with. And for that reason, we do think that there is going to have to be some authority on the federal level as far as siting is concerned. But again, it should be focused on certain qualifiers. As we look at that siting authority. First of all, should be facilities that are only identified on regional planning. Should be facilities that are interstate projects. It should be, in fact, the owners of those facilities should not be eligible for enhanced rates or any other financial incentives as far as where they're building that transmission. And the cost of the facility should be fairly and broadly allocated, along with the use of the facilities should not be limited to just one kind of power. It should not just be renewables only. And that's because of the fact that laws of physics, as we've heard expressed here today, doesn't distinguish between electrons. They're all the same once they get into that transmission system. And we'd also suggest that the law in which we're proposing this become a part of would in fact itself dictate the direction that we would be manufacturing or generating those particular electrons. Also, we would suggest that there needs to be broad, fair cost allocation. We think that's a very important point. Obviously, those of us who are electric cooperatives are very, very sensitive about that. We would have a few people, and all the costs being dumped on those few people would be unbearable. So it should be allocated on the basis of who's getting the benefit. Who are the folks that are receiving the benefits of that energy that is being generated and produced? Also, we would suggest, Mr. Chairman, that we move forward and recognize the fact that there are more benefits to building such a transmission system across this country or in different areas of this country than just the movement of that power. The right-of-ways for any kind of transmission like that would become extremely valuable. And it would also be a way in which it would, in fact, become a new technologies right-of-way, ways in which you could move new technologies. And I know you're particularly interested in the smart grid. And obviously there are many uses that it could be incorporated into any new transmission system along those lines. Fiber between the towers is obviously another way in which we can make good use of that transmission system. So, Mr. Chairman, I would suggest to you that we need a new transmission system to go along with the legislation that's being proposed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Glenn, very much. Our next witness is Reed Detchon. He is Executive Director of the Energy Future Coalition, a nonprofit organization that seeks to reform U.S. energy policy. We welcome you, sir. Whenever you're ready, please begin.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for inviting me to testify today on this important and timely topic. I find a great deal of agreement across the table, and particularly with Congressman English. Last year, in partnership with the Center for American Progress and the Energy Foundation, the Energy Future Coalition undertook a series of listening sessions with a diverse group of stakeholders, including federal agencies, grid operators, transmission companies, utilities, and environmental groups. And we found broad support for changes in federal law to facilitate the transmission needed to bring stranded renewable resources to market. Wind in the Great Plains, solar in the desert Southwest, and yes, offshore wind in the East. Our vision statement for the National Clean Energy Smart Grid, which is attached to my full statement, was endorsed by some 55 organizations, including the AFL-CIO, the Council on Competitiveness, and the Digital Energy Solutions Campaign, along with many renewable energy advocates and environmental groups, including the Sierra Club, who are not usually prone to supporting new transmission capacity. What brought these environmental groups to the table, and ultimately to agreement, was the imperative of action to address with urgency the growing climate crisis. Time is running out for the world to avoid serious harm from climate change. Mr. Chairman, you understand this challenge very well, and we owe a great debt of gratitude to you and Chairman Waxman for your leadership and acumen in advancing H.R. 2454, the American Clean Energy and Security Act. You have set the appropriate long-term target for emissions reductions more than 80% by 2050. The changes in our energy system needed to reach this goal are profound. We need to begin planning today to reach those reductions by 2050. And one thing is clear, we cannot deliver that much low-carbon energy without changes to the grid. Low-carbon electricity will be expected to power not only our homes and businesses, but also an increasing portion of our vehicle fleet. The system we have today for planning, permitting, and financing transmission lines was not designed to respond quickly to a challenge of this magnitude, moving many thousands of megawatts of renewable energy from remote areas to load centers. Our discussions with those who must deliver on this promise, renewable energy developers and transmission companies, quickly focused on the obstacles of planning, siting, and cost allocation that we've heard repeatedly today. Of these, planning turned out to be the linchpin, as our group concluded that better planning could reduce the difficulty of siting and financing new lines. We recommended enlarging the scale of the planning process to the two principal power grids in the United States, the eastern and western interconnections, for two reasons. First, long-distance transmission is needed to support development of some major renewable energy resources and necessarily will cross state and regional boundaries. For example, almost 300,000 megawatts, an enormous amount of wind, 300,000 megawatts of proposed wind projects, which is more than enough to meet 20% of our electricity needs, are waiting to connect to the grid because there is inadequate transmission capacity to carry the electricity they would produce. Second, planning for transmission to support the renewable energy standards in state and federal legislation must occur on a broad regional basis, just as the benefits of such investments will be shared on a broad regional basis. Your discussion of the impact of wind resources in the East is a good illustration of the need for planning across the entire interconnection. An enhanced regional planning process of this kind should build on, not replace, the current engagement of stakeholders, including states, grid operators, utilities, consumer and environmental interests, and landowner groups. This will remain a state, not a federal process. Siting authority would rest with FERC, but the states collectively would have more power, not less, than they do now, because their plans would govern the exercise of that federal authority. Only if the planning process breaks down would FERC have the ability to resolve disputes and get transmission built to bring renewable energy to market. We've been gratified to see many of our recommendations reflected in H.R. 2211, introduced by Congressman Inslee, a system of interconnection-wide transmission planning supported by broad-based cost allocation and underpinned by federal siting authority. And we would be pleased to work with the committee on further legislative language if you think that would be helpful. Mr. Chairman, you and your colleagues have taken an enormous step forward by reporting legislation that will begin the process of transforming our nation's energy system to deal with the threat of global climate change. Expanding and modernizing our transmission grid is essential to that transformation. By addressing transmission directly and comprehensively, you can help our common goal of a clean energy future become a reality and not be left stranded by regulatory impediments. Our economy, environment, and national security deserve no less. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Our next witness is Joseph Welch, Chairman and President and Chief Executive Officer of ITC Holdings. That is the nation's first independent transmission company. We welcome you, sir. Please begin.
Thank you and good afternoon.
Could you move that microphone in a little bit closer and turn it on?
Thank you and good afternoon, Chairman Markey and members of the subcommittee. As the Chairman said, my name is Joseph Welch. I'm Chairman, CEO, and President of ITC Holdings, the nation's first and only independent transmission company in the United States. Being independent means that we are not affiliated with any market participant. We have no ownership or have any dealings in energy transactions. Our job is to facilitate the market, to facilitate the interconnection of any sources of generation that are put before us, and to make sure that we connect the loads and reliably do so. We own and operate about 15,000 miles of high voltage lines in Iowa, Minnesota, Illinois, Missouri, Michigan, and are developing regional transmission projects in Kansas and Oklahoma. As we have worked through these various states, each time we come to the point where we need to build transmission for whatever reason, we have come up against a set of obstacles, each one different in every state. Probably that is as it should be, but when we get to the outcome of where we want to go in this country, this is going to become a major impediment for us to move forward as a country who dearly and necessarily needs to seek energy independence. I brought with me today a report from the Council on Competitiveness and Energy Sustainability, which I believe is a good framework, and I will leave it with you for you to read. I think it offers a lot of information which is very consistent with the very principles and items that you're considering here. But going to the fundamental principles that we need, and at the top of the list, and I want to go right to the top of the list, we need a policy for energy in this country. We've talked about all the things underneath, and we debate about whether it's right or wrong, but the fundamental issue is that we need a policy and something to plan to. With that policy in place, the rest of the items become a lot clearer and a lot more succinct, and a lot of the debates that we hear from all of us who really are closer than further apart really start to come together. For instance, with a policy, then the planners, and when I say the planners, and we have talked about this in the item that I support and my company supports, is that we need an independent planning authority We need to take the policy and get the policy implemented in a very clear and succinct way. Secondly, if you have the policy, then the cost allocation can be dictated by the policy itself, meaning that from that policy, we now know where we want to go, we now know who are the benefactors and what those benefactor issues are. And so that policy sits at the top, and we need that. And last but not least, when we get down to the very bones, I always tell people, being in the transmission business, it's a great business until I do one of two things. And the first item is build new transmission lines. The minute we start to build them, it becomes a nightmare. And the process is hard and it's long. And what we need is true federal backstop siting authority. That is not meant to cut the states out of the process. The states should be involved in the process. They are the most knowledgeable about local issues. But at the end of the day, we have to get a regional transmission grid built. As you've heard here, there are literally thousands and upon thousands of megawatts of renewable energy that this country needs to deploy, and we need to deploy it now. And if we start now, we are years and years away from our goal line. So please, let's have this conclusion and bring it to it. And I thank you very much for my opportunity to speak here today.
Thank you, Mr. Welch. Our next witness is Christopher Miller. He is president of the Piedmont Environmental Council, an environmental organization focused on conservation issues in the Piedmont region of Virginia. We thank you for being here, sir.
Thank you, Congressman Markey. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on behalf of the Piedmont Environmental Council, but also for land trusts and land conservation organizations throughout the country. We're a very active member of the Land Trust Alliance, been working hard on this issue with them, and they have asked us to express some of their concerns. I have a couple of maps, which I hope the staff can put up, because I think they'll help instruct this conversation. We appreciate the time and attention that this committee is taking to consider the complex issues associated with transmission. Mm-hmm. We appreciate the willingness of the committee to deal with transmission as part of a broader energy policy and not as an end in itself. From our perspective, transmission is only a tool for moving electricity from the source of generation to the end user. But much more important are the policies that will reduce demand for electricity, modify peak demand so that the need for generation and transmission infrastructure is minimized, and encourage clean generation close to load centers, which will reduce the losses of energy caused by long-distance transmission. For in the end, the high-voltage transmission lines with towers that can exceed 180 feet in height and wide rights-of-way are part of the part of the energy system with the largest footprint and often the most dramatic impacts on communities that lie along them. The transmission system has the potential for substantial land use impacts, including impacts that directly conflict with federal, state, and local policies to protect and enhance important natural and cultural resources. In the brief amount of time I have, I want to focus on a couple issues that have not been raised yet. The first is the assertion that the only way we can meet national and state goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to increase the role of renewable sources of energy is to build a national transmission grid. And one example of this grid is up here. This is the grid proposed by AEP for the 765 kV system that would link resources. It was originally overlaid over wind resources, but in fact the correspondence with coal resources is actually higher when you actually go and see where those lines are laid out. And that's one of the causes of concern, is that in fact what you'd be doing by doing a transmission-loaded set of incentives is in fact encouraging greater transmission of coal-fired generation than in fact of renewables. And the reason for that is that nowhere in legislation do we recommend a change in the economic dispatch rules that govern which generation is brought online first. All the renewable goals notwithstanding, we dispatch energy by price, and the auctions are by price, and we've heard lots of calls for competitive pricing. But the potential that will in fact increase the amount of transmission that is carrying coal-fired emissions, and in fact from the dirtiest and oldest plants is very real. Unless this committee can also ensure that before that transmission is made available, we are in fact putting in the carbon cuts through the carbon and cap and trade and otherwise governing the emissions of grandfathered coal plants that have never reduced their emissions, there's a very real possibility in the Eastern Interconnect that the gains that have been made by RGGI, the 45 million tons or so of carbon emissions reductions, could be offset. A second issue that has not been addressed so far is the issue of peak versus average demand. Peak, the transmission and generation system is being designed to meet peak loads, and the more we can do to reduce peak loading, the less we have to build across our landscape. And so it's very important that this committee address the fact that transmission planning that has been done to this point really hasn't addressed the full incorporation of some of the policies that are in the ACES legislation. They have not taken into account the amount of demand-side management that is recommended, and in fact assume a level of per capita electricity use that steadily increases over time rather than is reduced. The final thought is this. To the extent that transmission is necessary, and obviously connecting some renewables will require transmission, it's very important to respect the other public policy values that are out there, and particularly related to the lands that have to be crossed by transmission. We should be seeking to avoid, wherever possible, the natural resources, the historic resources, the cultural resources, and yes, even the landscapes that America values so much. Current legislation draws a distinction between publicly owned lands and privately owned lands, and that's something that I think this committee needs to look at hard. East of the Mississippi, most natural resource lands, most historic lands are privately owned, but protected through public-private partnerships, whether it's the designation of historic districts or the donation of conservation and historic easements. Those easements are often approved by state government. In the case of Massachusetts, hundreds of thousands of acres are actually individually approved each time by the Attorney General. The same is true in the state of Virginia. And they are due all of the respect that a national park, a national wildlife refuge, a state park would be due. So as you think forward on those transmission lines that have to be built, make sure that we're avoiding the resources, the private resources as well as the public resources, and make sure that we mitigate and compensate it for the impacts on those resources.
Thank you, Mr. Miller, very much. And our final witness is David Jose. He is the President and Chief Executive Officer of CMS Energy and Chief Executive Officer of its principal subsidiary, Consumers Energy. We welcome you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you also for pronouncing my name properly. I appreciate that. I appreciate
it took 1 minute up here to get it right, but I wanted to make sure, huh?
I appreciate the opportunity to address the subcommittee this afternoon. Consumers Energy, our principal subsidiary, serves 1.8 million electric customers, 1.7 million natural gas customers in the lower peninsula of Michigan. I would suggest that we have a bit of a unique opportunity, having developed, owned, and operated transmission assets along with distribution and generation assets for a century. Consumers Energy now no longer owns transmission assets. We sold our transmission system in 2002, and it is now independently operated. We therefore appreciate the difficulty in siting new transmission and support federal backstop authority for new interstate lines as a last resort. We also see a need for new transmission in Michigan to interconnect new wind resources that are being developed in the Thumb in particular and along the Lake Michigan shoreline as part of the Renewable Portfolio Standard compliance effort in the state of Michigan. We believe new transmission development should meet three key common sense principles. Number one, benefits of proposed projects should exceed the costs by a reasonable margin. Number two, proposed project should be similar or should be superior to other alternatives, which would include other transmission solutions, distribution solutions, perhaps lower voltage transmission solutions, and generation solutions. And finally, costs ought to be fairly allocated to the beneficiaries of the project as determined through the planning process. I would concede that these principles are complex to apply and therefore need an independent planning authority of some sort to apply them, a regional transmission organization or a group of RTOs, for example, to conduct the evaluation. They cannot be objectively performed by market participants, including independent transmission owners that have a vested interest in new transmission. In our view, overly generous FERC incentive policies have created a rush to invest in transmission, often not justified on a cost-benefit basis. I provide some specific Michigan examples within my written testimony and won't go over those now. Fortunately, for new intrastate projects in Michigan, we have a certificate of need process that fully vets these projects before allowing condemnation. I suggest that might be a model that's appropriate at the federal level as a federal backstop. Now there are proposals to build massive new high-voltage infrastructure over the entire Eastern Interconnect, the so-called overlays. Part of that, a $3.2 billion 765 kV project, largely in Michigan, has already been evaluated by the Midwest Independent System Operator and determined not to meet a cost-benefit test for the state of Michigan. A number of independent system operators and planning authorities in the Eastern Interconnect recently studied a joint coordinated system plan that was referred to earlier, involving a $56 billion high-voltage overlay. Some have referred to it as the equivalent of constructing the interstate highway system. That study concluded that Michigan would receive virtually no benefit at fairly large cost. Looking just at consumers' customers, if costs were spread on a, quote, postage stamp basis to all our customers, we'd pay about $159 million a year of increased cost for roughly a $2 million annual benefit. I would submit that Michigan simply can't afford that. Another $10 to $12 billion project that's been proposed to bring wind power from the Dakotas to as far east as Chicago, of course, does not reach Michigan. But further, when the cost of that transmission is included in the equation, Michigan-based generation is less expensive to develop. On that score, we agree with the 10 Northeast and Mid-Atlantic governors with regard to the potential implications on developing renewable resources locally. Let me be clear, we don't object to such projects if the benefits exceed the cost by a reasonable margin, reasonable alternatives have been considered, and the costs are spread appropriately to the beneficiaries. That might be, for example, Dakota wind developers or purchasers of that power who need to meet their own standards. Finally, Michigan transmission rates today are 4 times what they were in 2002 when we sold the system. Even without these overlay projects, we're forecasting they'll increase by another 50% from today's rates over the next 6 years. Transmission investment is occurring in the state of Michigan. We don't feel that FERC rate-making oversight currently is sufficient in states where transmission is independently owned and therefore not subject to state regulatory oversight. That situation, along with overly rich incentives, are causing, in our view, transmission development that is sometimes not in the best interest of our customers. In summary, we think targeted transmission investment is needed, both in Michigan and nationally. We believe that planning and evaluation by RTOs or groups of RTOs that are independent from market participants is an appropriate way to pursue that. And we think 3 key principles need to be followed. 1, benefits exceed costs by a reasonable margin. 2, reasonable alternatives have been considered. And 3, the costs are appropriately allocated to the beneficiaries. Thank you again.
Thank you. And we thank our entire panel.